Good morning, everyone. We're at 9:30, so the hearings can resume. I'll introduce myself briefly because there are a few fresh faces in the room. I'm Paul Griffiths. I'm an architect and a member of the IHBC, along with my colleague Simon Barclay, who's not with us this week. I'm the inspector appointed to examine the plan at issue. As is usual, I'm going to ask Carol to do the housekeeping announcements.
Good morning. As usual, there's no programmed fire alarm test during the examination, so if the alarm does go off, can you leave the building at the nearest exit, which is presumably the front of the building, or follow any of the green fire exit signs. When you do leave at the front, can you make your way left down to the Claremont Terrace to the front of the GMB building? We'll congregate there. Do not come back into the building unless you're told to do so by a member of the fire service. The toilets are on the corridor there at the back of the hall. There is water available on the table. If anybody in the gallery, we've also got water available in the foyer. Other refreshments are available to buy on Gillygate, or there's a Sainsbury's on Bootham. We're also recording the session, so if anybody has any issues about being recorded, if you can let me know, I can make sure that you're located in a seat where it's not going to pick you up. There's also the Wi-Fi details, a Citadel guest, password General Booth 1883, and those are on the posters either side of the room. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. We're here this morning to continue with matter 1, Greenbelt boundaries, other densely developed areas as referred to in the topic paper. This afternoon at 2 o'clock, we're doing outer Greenbelt boundaries. It would be useful, I think, for my purposes at least, if we could just go around the room quickly and introduce yourselves for me. I'll start with Mr. Linus.
Morning, sir. Thank you. Scott Linus, KC, acting for the Council.
Good morning. Jane Healy-Brown, Director at Arup, on behalf of the Council on Greenbelt Matters.
Good morning, sir. Joe Perkins, representing Banks Group.
Good morning, sir. Matthew Good from Pegasus Group, representing Lovell Developments.
Morning, sir. Mark Johnson, Johnson Mowat, representing Taylor Wimpey on an area to the west of Coppenthorpe.
Morning, everyone. Stuart Natkus, Barton Wilmot, on behalf of Barton David Wilson Homes.
Good morning, sir. Thorfinn Caithness from Edwardson Associates, representing clients with land at Rougheth and Fulford. Thank you.
Morning, sir. Chris Lee from Gladman.
Good morning, sir. Thomas Pilcher, Pilcher Homes, representing some land in Weldrake.
Morning, sir. Chris Megson, DPP, on behalf of Mulgrave Properties and Crossway Commercial Estates Limited.
And did we miss someone who sat down late?
Yes, thank you.
Mr. Key.
Thank you, sir. Doug Jennings, representing Mr. Miller of Green Acres, Merton.
Sorry, sir, I didn't quite catch the end of that.
Sorry, can you just repeat that for us?
Doug Jennings, representing Mr. Miller at Merton, Green Acres, Merton.
Okay, thank you. Now, in terms of the format of the discussion, I'm going to follow pretty much the path that we took the other day. For the purposes of those who weren't here when we talked about inner Greenbelt boundaries, it's not the intention to talk about methodology in itself. We've covered that already at some length, and we really don't need to revisit it. That's not to say you can't introduce methodology if it bears on the particular point that you want to make. That's perfectly fine. But my intention is not to go through the addendum annex page by page. We'll have a short introduction from the council, and then I'll leave it open it to the floor to raise any particular issues you have, and then we'll deal with those in turn, hopefully. That's how I see the day or the morning panning out. If there's any issue, we can deal with it as it arises. Unless there's anything else, then I'm going to hand over to you, Mr. Linus. Go on.
Thank you, sir. Just a few words of introduction. From me, as you'll be well aware now, and as discussed previously, boundary setting was subject to a four-stage approach, which I'll summarise to set the scene. Stage one involved establishing strategic principles, and they included, insofar as is relevant to this morning, the principle that villages are developed not entirely subsumed and or that retain a separation from the main urban area need to be considered separately in relation to their contribution to openness. And that was drawn from paragraph 86 of the MPPF. And as stage two of that approach, this principle was applied to determine if villages and other densely developed areas should be included or excluded from the green belt, applying that paragraph of the MPPF. And as the topic paper explained, the degree of openness or the contribution openness makes to the green belt isn't uniform in some cases, so planning judgment had to be applied based on the context of available evidence and site visits where necessary. And on the basis of each of the urban areas, a conclusion was drawn as to whether or not the area should be included or excluded from the green belt. And those findings appear in Annex 4 of the topic paper. Once that stage was complete, the third stage involved considering the need to promote sustainable patterns of development and accommodate development in the main urban area. And all reasonable options were examined for meeting the identified need within urban areas, and that resulted in an acknowledgement that further land was going to be required to meet need, and that would include locations potentially beyond the main urban area. Stage 4 of the approach involves the detailed definition of boundaries for the villages and other densely developed areas which were proposed to be excluded from the green belt, including those areas where need had to be met. And we've been through it already, but the detailed green belt boundary methodology that was set out in section 8 of the topic paper was applied, and that involved applying criteria linked to the relevant green belt purposes, and then looking at the permanence of boundaries and consistency with the local plan strategy. That analysis is boiled down into the main topic paper, but the detail is in Annex 4, which is split into two parts. The first is those villages which are proposed to be excluded, and for each village and area, the justification of the boundary is set out using identified boundary sections. Part 2 includes those villages and areas proposed to be included in the green belt. That's the broad process. As I've emphasised previously, sir, we recognise that the boundaries have been assessed in accordance with the methodology. We think they are clear and defensible, but we recognise the elements of professional judgment that are required in each case. We've looked at alternative boundaries where we thought there were potentially defensible ones, and we recognise that in some cases legitimate areas of debate, which are best resolved by you hearing the evidence today and simply looking at these matters on site. So for that reason, we welcome obviously points being raised by objectors today. We can respond to them and leave it to yourself to determine the dispute. That's all I'd want to say by way of summary, sir.
That's helpful, Mr. Linus. Thank you. Who would like to start the discussion? Mr. Pilcher, then. Go on.
Thank you, sir. I'm actually going to let Mr. Megson go ahead in some ways because as a professional planner, he's probably better qualified to explain some of the problems. But can I just bring your attention to the village of Weldrake? So if I can get you to look at the core document EX CYC 59F, and which I believe is Annex 4, and you're looking for the actual page number of A4, 301. Shall I give you a moment to find it? And that's 308 as far as a PDF, I think it shows up as. And I believe that both of us here are here to talk about boundary 3. If you can see, sir, that would be coloured in blue. And I think it's quite an obvious one. And obviously, Mr. Linus will know that we're here to refer to that boundary, and it just happens to be the sort of shape of an emission site. The site number, it's just a coincidence, I think, that the boundary just happens to take that shape. 967. So now, the boundary we would contest is not the right boundary, and I think the recommendation for a main modification is that the boundary would go from boundary 2 over to boundary 4. And I'm just going to stand back and let Mr. Megson go through the reasons and recent history.
Go ahead, Mr. Megson. I've got the documents up in front of me, so carry on.
I think so. The context for this site is that we know this is a site that actually has been assessed using the methodology 3 times, and on each of those occasions in the Local Plan Preferred Options Draft 2013, then again at publication draft version 2014, and finally Preferred Sites Local Plan Consultation 2016. On all 3 occasions, it's been deemed by the Council that this site doesn't have sufficient value to be kept in the green belt. Same case as well, back in 1995, inspectors examining the North Yorkshire County Council post-modifications York Greenbelt Local Plan arrived at the same conclusion. Now, of course, back then they weren't using the same methodology. The council assessed it against their methodology. But when we apply that methodology, I'm still struggling to really get my head around it and some of the conclusions drawn from that in the analysis. So, for example, boundary 3, which we're looking at, the suggested boundary extends over 2 open fields with no clear or permanent features as such. And the justification is it follows a consistent line connecting 2 points on the ground, which is stated by the council. I just find that unconvincing, and I'm struggling to understand how such an approach could possibly result in a permanent and clear boundary, whereas conversely, the boundary that we suggest in the written submission follows a really logical and follows a permanent feature, i.e. the drainage ditch to the north of the site. Equally, in the assessment as well, we know that the council's main justification for including H28 within the proposed green belt is that the land has significant legibility of landscape features preserved through time, important for the historic setting of the village. Again, I'm just struggling to understand if this is a correct interpretation of Purpose 4, which is obviously to preserve the setting and special character of historic towns, but Weldrake isn't a town. I think really, for me, there were the various sort of errors and inconsistencies we've set out in the written reps, but I won't recite them all for you now, sir, but there were the sort of 2 that jumped out. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Megson. Mr. Linus?
So I'll ask Ms Healy-Brown to deal with this, but I understand that these issues have been traversed before in terms of looking at the allocation of land in Weldrake, so there has to some extent been some debate on this issue already, but I'll ask Ms Healy-Brown to explain the position.
Thank you. Yes, you may recall, sir, we did discuss this location last week when we were talking about the housing allocation, which is around boundary 5 within Weldrake. And I think it was representatives from the parish council at that point also talked about the area of land that's been suggested today, which is the area that is in the vicinity of boundary 3. And so I will just repeat what was said last week in that the assessment looks at this area. It is really a site selection point, more importantly, I think, than a greenbelt point. The alternative boundary, which would extend across the top, if you like, of the area, boundary 3, would be a potential alternative boundary and was considered in the assessment. There are, however, recognisable and permanent features that form what is proposed as Boundary 3, because the development need and site selection process has not identified this as a location for development. That's where the recognisable and permanent boundary that is formed by Boundary 3 is proposed.
So I think as well, just for your reference, at page 308 of Annex 4, it acknowledges that as an alternative, land contained on 3 sides by Boundary 3 could instead be included within the village envelope. However, it's identified through purpose 4, the land has significant legibility of landscape features preserved through time, important for the historic setting of the village, and on balance, the proposed boundary seeks to retain this important relationship to the village. So that's the second paragraph under Boundary 3. Again, that's a matter of judgment, which I think you need to see on the ground, and that's the nub of the analysis on Boundary 3 and the alternative, sir.
Mr. Megson, Mr. Pilcher.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the opportunity. I'd like to thank our KC, Mr. Linus, and Jane Healy-Brown for a massive concession there, where it just feels like they've said that you're going to see it in person, and you're going to probably understand that the reason why this boundary has been drawn like this comes back to site selection. But I'm afraid to say, we're discussing greenbelt boundaries that are supposed to be permanent, to last well beyond the plan period. They've had the advice saying we should be looking at boundaries that are going up to the 2042, but I think probably longer if you want to have really good permanent boundaries. And I think they've basically said the reason why this boundary would scotch this site is because members of a parish council don't feel like allocating this site. But we're not saying they're allocating this site. We understand that there's a process for allocations and that it's political. We're saying that when we set the greenbelt boundaries for the first time, that we use the right boundaries that can endure well beyond, that we don't unnecessarily cover land that does not need to be covered. And in their own assessment, they're effectively saying, no, well, this doesn't have to be greenbelt land, but it's not been chosen as a site. So I think they're making it easy for us to say that Boundary 3, even if it should exist, should go as a straight line across the top. Now, I'm going to bore you just for a moment on the long history of this, because we've been given a lot of the sort of 1990s history, but I have in my submissions given you pictures, plans and drawings, including technical drawings of drainage designs that actually go back to the Derwent Rural District plans. And I've put a drawing in, which is a number MC72.5A, which was approved by the Derwent Rural District Planning Committee in July 1970. And Jenny Hubbard was there at the time and actually worked there as the officer. And you know, the long and short of it is everyone in Weldrake has known that this land does not need to be kept permanently open to protect the historic character of the city of York, and that this is obviously just an issue of site selection. So what I'm asking you, sir, is if when you visit the site, or even just look at it from Google Earth, and I think anyone can see, that this is the wrong boundary, there's an opportunity here to set a boundary that is defensible for the long term, and it may well be at 5-year reviews or later in a process when this site, which has been variously an Appendix 1 site, will come back, and the City of York will need it. We're not going to go back into the OAN, but we know their OAN is wrong. We on this side know it's wrong, and we know that they're going to fail to deliver on the windfall sites. And when the windfall sites of nearly 2,500 plots need to come forwards, you know, every time you look at the trajectory, it's getting worse and worse. And these sorts of medium sites, they will need to bring forwards at their 5-year review, because they will put their hands up and say, yeah, we've under-delivered. And we don't want to have to use exceptional circumstances to pull out sites that were Appendix 1 sites. So my hope is that you're able to say, here's a boundary. A better boundary would be in a straight line. It makes for a better shape when we talk about sustainable patterns of development and logical infilling. And it may not be an allocation now, so that's not really an issue for them getting a plan over the line. But in due course, they will be able to come back to it, and they will explain to the parish council that actually they do need some more sites, and that this site is finally going to come to pass. My other point that I've written in my written submissions is actually it's a technical one, which is that these boundaries that we supposedly start with when we I know we're setting them for the first time, but for the first several months or years of the plan process, the council would often refer to the boundaries that they've been defending under development management purposes, 2005 draft plan. And they'll often refer to these boundaries as being the fourth set of changes, and people often don't go through which changes were approved. But what I would contest is that the recommendation to be made, which number 69, reference D80, part of D80 south of a drainage ditch for greenbelt housing, that document should be the basis. So when they effectively talk about creating their stuff for the first time, but it being based on their fourth set of changes, I think we're contesting that someone really needs to go through the fine-tooth comb to work out what they think their proposed changes that they took through the 1990s were, because I would contest that this site is already not in the greenbelt, but we haven't put it through a planning process and an appeal process. And I would say we're certainly not creating new greenbelt in this local plan, and I don't think Mr. Linus will say that we're creating new greenbelt. Therefore, if it has already been removed, this boundary 3 would be wrong from a legal basis, because they've not made any case to say they're creating new greenbelt. So I think that needs to be sort of checked, and it may well be that the council's internal lawyers can either confirm to you what their actual process was for removing stuff from the greenbelt in the 1990s, and whether those boundaries that were removed, or those pieces of land that were removed, whether they have any legal status, or whether they're just saying, oh, scrap everything that we've talked about, and we're just defining for the first time now. So, and that's a sort of a legal point I think you're going to probably ask them to define. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Pilcher. Mr. Landis, it might be useful if you outline the council's position on that. I mean, I would say what I thought, but I'd rather you to start with, at least.
Well, I mean, the straightforward legal position is that, as we've established through earlier phases of the examination, you have a general extent of green belt, and we're setting boundaries for the first time through this inquiry. And whilst there may be some contextual interest in what has happened in appeals beforehand, and what attempts have been made to establish whether or not land is in or outside the green belt, that's not directly relevant for the exercise that you have to conduct under the MPPF, sir. So the exercise you have to carry out is based on the assumption that there is a general extent of green belt, but we are setting green belt boundaries for the first time, and we're not creating a new green belt. That's the simple position. Okay. As for other points, we're not making a massive concession as it was put. We were simply recognising that there are elements of judgment to be exercised, as they have to be at various stretches of the boundary. When you go on to site and you assess the conclusion that was included at Annex 4, page 308, where it was concluded that, as identified through Purpose 4, The land has legibility of landscape features preserved through time, which are important for the historic setting of the village, and the proposed boundary sought to retain that important relationship to the village. That's a question of judgment which you have to reach, having seen the site in question. As for wider points, I'm not going to over old ground, because Mr. Pilcher's raised this point about effectively the green belt boundaries not being sufficiently permanent to cater for long-term needs. But in brief summary, as I've mentioned before, the topic paper explains how the green belt boundaries have been drawn having regard to proposals to meet the need plus a surplus to ensure permanence of green belt boundaries beyond the planned period, which in the same way avoids the need to safeguard land. So we don't consider that the prospect of effectively having green belt boundaries which aren't permanent because we haven't sufficiently met needs through this green belt boundary setting exercise is going to arise, because we provided for that, we've anticipated that in the boundary exercise that's taken place. As for other points that were raised on behalf of Pilcher Homes, essentially, sir, you have boundaries which have been identified through the application of the Green Belt methodology, which we say are consistent with the local plan strategy for meeting development needs. And the question is whether the boundary proposed meets those tests through the methodology. If so, we say the boundary should be confirmed in that designation. The fact that other sites have been proposed in other locations does not mean that the boundary that we're proposing is unsound, and one must focus on the boundary that we have proposed. If a site isn't taken forward through our boundary setting exercise as an emissions site, it's because, as the annex details, alternatives were considered under the question of strategic permanence and consistency of the local plan strategy, and it was found nonetheless that the boundary proposed was consistent with the local plan strategy in preference to other alternatives, and that is combined with the assessment against greenbelt purposes earlier on for each settlement in the annex. So, as I said, it's not simply a case where we have conceded that this is purely a site selection issue. The analysis is more involved than that, and as I've mentioned, we have in any event set out analysis under green belt purposes against boundary 3, which needs to be fed into the analysis.
Thank you, Mr. Linus. I will, of course, or my colleague and I will, of course, visit the site and take a look, along with some of the others that we talked about the other day. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add, Mr. Pilcher or Mr. Megson.
Only finally, thank you. We understand that often this is just a difference of opinion, and sometimes you might choose a different boundary to the one we would choose. My only final thing I would say is, in order for a plan to be sound, it does require, I think, is it 182 or something, that it says you need to be positively prepared. And I think in the back of our minds, we've always got this issue of 2012, the government say we need to significantly boost the supply of housing. York always operate on the basis of how little can we get away with. You know, they're not saying we've got loads of safeguarded land, or we've got loads of spare sites, and we'll bring them forward when we want them. They're saying we can just get away without safeguarded land by just allocating enough up to 2037, which we think 5 years is just enough to generate beyond the plan period, not well beyond the plan period, but just enough against the advice they received. So I would just contest that the general theme is that this plan is obviously always about how little can they get away with. And I'm asking the inspectorate to hold them to the obligations of the framework, which is to positively prepare a plan to proactively look to bring forward sites. And all we're saying on this one is if you change that boundary and you put the right boundary in, our boundary, then they'll have the opportunity to come back later. So it's not we're not saying allocate us instead or as well as the other one. We're just saying let's get this boundary in the right place and it might be a future opportunity which the City of York, they might not resent at their 5-year review. Thank you.
I understand. Thank you. Mr. Linus, was there anything else?
No, thank you.
Okay, I'll move on. This side of the room, shall we start at the top? Mr. Natkus?
So I'm just going to give way to Mr. Johnson because we've got quite similar points and I don't want to steal all of his.
That's fine, I'm relaxed. Go on, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, sir. It's just probably just as well we were sat together accidentally on this one. This is Copmanthorpe, sir. So with respect to the paper 59F, pages A4, and I'll just give you 4-page reference numbers. So it's A4, 18, 28, 29 and 31. And if I can just go to the first one of those, it's A418. A418 shows us that Copmanthorpe has got 5 defined boundaries. Our case here is with boundary 3. We've got no particular point with respect to boundaries, well, the other 4 boundaries. Clearly boundary 4 borders the A64, it's very logical. Boundary 1 is very logical because it borders the railway line. Boundary 5 is actually a very small triangular area off to the northeast, and we've got no issues with the extension to include a small allocation in that area. With respect to our concerns on boundary 3 is not an historic boundary, it's a relatively modern boundary. And this is, sir, a point about whether or not the housing number is right, whether or not there is scope for further growth of Copmanthorpe. And with respect to boundary 3, if I can just take you to page A428. I'm just skipping over the text, sir, with respect to what it says about the various boundaries in these pages, on the basis that what it says about the various boundaries in the text between pages 18 and 28 is actually very little. It actually says very little about boundary 3 on the basis that when you get to page A428, you can see why, is the constraints to Copmanthorpe in that constraints plan on the western edge of Copmanthorpe along boundary 3. There are virtually no constraints. There are no constraints with respect to the Greenbelt methodology paper. And this series a point about whether or not Copmanthorpe is capable of taking additional growth in a westerly direction, to which we say it is. With respect to that boundary, there are no historic views of York. There are no issues of flood risk. There are no issues of biodiversity. And there's no point with respect to the historic setting of the village, in effect, the point previously made on the last conversation. So we then take you to page A29, which I think is, again, quite a useful plan, which shows is that the western boundary has got the ability to absorb some growth with a new Greenbelt boundary, or within what would be regarded as the 800-metre walking distances to accessible services. And then finally, sir, just taking you to the following page, which is A31, there are various options that have been mooted with respect to this site, and we propose a boundary change that would absorb boundary 3 site 944. Now, I do accept is that this is a potential conversation about a missed opportunity on an allocation, but if sir, you get the chance to visit the site, is that our case would be, if this housing number needs to change, and it may need to change, is that the western edge of Copmanthorpe presents a very logical alternative to finding an additional site. And at that point, sir, I'll let Mr. Napkis add any additional points if he has any.
This almost sounds rehearsed, doesn't it, despite the fact we only realised our sites were adjacent to each other about 5 minutes ago. But I'm going to talk on some of the words rather than the pictures. Mr. Johnson skipped over them. If you have a look, and it's just a very quick summary of them, Criterion 1, which is to do with heritage aspects, refers to preventing expansion of Copnamthorpe and protecting its historic core and historic setting. But of course, Copnamthorpe isn't a historic town. So preserving the setting of the centre of Copnamthorpe is completely irrelevant for Greenbelt purposes. And again, it's this reference to preventing expansion. We're setting Greenbelt boundaries. I won't go over it in depth, but you know the point that we're saying about this. The site was previously allocated. The only thing that changed was the housing number. It previously wasn't in the Greenbelt, then it was put back into the Greenbelt. When you look at the boundaries that are in place, boundary 5 is actually, well, it doesn't make any sense, doesn't boundary 5, because you've got a railway line and you've got the A64 and this triangle of land that's actually allocated for housing. So why you would draw the boundary excluding the new housing allocation doesn't make any sense to me. I appreciate this is an evidence base, but I think it just shows the point of how this approach has been taken just to drawing a boundary along the edge of settlements. And I think the wording demonstrates that. I've mentioned about the historic town. There's nothing to do with landmark buildings. Nothing is referenced with regard to boundary 3 in terms of preserving the setting of York. With regards to sprawl and encroachment, the only adverse comments are that there's nothing on the land. To be honest, that applies to every single piece on the edge of York outside the boundary. If there's nothing on it, that doesn't mean it should be Greenbelt. We have to look at the purposes and we have to look at the council's evidence base. And the council's evidence base historically has shown that this site shouldn't be within the Greenbelt. The figure 7, which was, I appreciate, superseded, no doubt will be told was superseded, went through purposes and demonstrated this site shouldn't be in it. The new evidence and the new methodology when applied looking at text, the only thing I can find in the text is the fact that the site currently isn't built on, but to me that's not sufficient in order to put it in. And if we look at the previous options that the council have talked about, all this seems to do is provide tables that shows them, but it doesn't give any reasons as to why they've actually been dismissed. And when you go through the methodology, the wording within the actual purposes of Greenbelt, to me, don't provide you with sufficient evidence as to why this land should be within the Greenbelt. But I think then you get to the nub of it, which is when we go past sustainable patterns of development and the allocations, and we effectively get onto defensible boundaries. And I think that this whole assessment has been based on clear defensible boundaries and just drawing the boundary on the edge of the settlement as currently defined, and that's not the exercise that we're going for. It was touched upon earlier as to the council's approach to dealing with the Greenbelt, and it's been through the courts, and it was deemed that the general extent isn't all Greenbelt, and you should make an assessment as to each individual piece of land and whether it should be within the Greenbelt or not. That's the approach that the courts have held. It's the approach that the council themselves have taken. They defended that case. So the general extent isn't the starting point for the Greenbelt. It was something in the RSS. Applications and appeals have worked on the basis of assessing individual sites and whether they should be within the Greenbelt or not. And that's the exercise the council should have done here. And I don't believe they've done it. I think they've just drawn it around the edge of the settlement and the evidence doesn't support those boundaries. So we would ask you to look at the site and amend boundary 3.
Mr. Linus?
Thank you, Chair. I'll be very brief and then pass over to Ms Healy-Brown to see if there's anything to add. When one looks through the text that Mr Narkis has mentioned, again, it's a matter of judgments that are expressed there, where on page 21, there's a reference to the land retaining its rural setting, approaching from the west, with open views across agricultural landscape. Page 23, beyond the extent of the built-up area contained by boundaries 2, 3 and 5, the landscape consists of a combination of large and small fields separated by hedges and sporadic trees, providing an open aspect to the flat landscape in this area. Page 24, land out with boundaries 2 and 3, characterised by an absence of built development or urbanising influences, apart from several isolated properties, Farmstead and Railway Line itself being mostly large open fields, forming a strong contrast to the built extent of Copnamthorpe. And page 25, again, page 26, sorry, for example, boundary 3 on permanence. Boundary in this section follows historic field and carriageway track boundaries to the mid-19th century, with some 20th and early 21st century development boundaries. The boundary offers permanence. So as one goes through the criteria, it's clear that judgments have been reached applying the criteria based on an understanding of the contribution that land to the west of the settlement makes to those criteria, along with an assessment of the extent to which the boundary offers some permanence. So we'd reject any suggestion that we simply have drawn the line around the boundary of the existing settlement, because the criteria have been applied as a fair analysis or a judgment based on pages 21 through to 32 reveals. Again, sir, I suspect that you've got to take what's written there and take a view.
Thank you. Just a couple of points to add. So, as Mr Linus has said, there is the full assessment against the purposes and the methodology as defined in Annex and for your attention. So that is starts on page A418 and runs through to A434. I wanted to clarify one point, if I may. And Mr Natcus talks about purpose 4 and the relevance in relation to this location. As you know from the methodology, purpose 4 is separated into 3 criteria. Pages 19, 20 and 21, so within the section I've just flagged, assess this area around the whole settlement in relation to those 3 criteria. Criteria 1 and criteria 3 are the ones where it is seen it's particularly relevant here. You can have a look at the more detail on that, and some of it Mr Linus has referred to, but it's about, in criterion 1, looking about land around Copmanthorpe being kept permanently open to maintain the scale and identity of a compact village in the rural landscape. And there's further detail beyond that. And then particularly looking at criterion 3, which we have looked at previously, which is, I think, a really important one here. And that is land needs to be kept permanently open to protect the setting and special character of the wider city landscape and character of York, which includes a clock face of smaller compact villages, particularly as perceived from open approaches. And I think it's that last part around the clock face of smaller compact villages I particularly wanted to draw attention to. Thank you.
Thank you both. Was there anything either of you wanted to add?
So just a quick point, really. I don't disagree with sort of what Mr Linus says about the open character of the site. And it is, you'll go and see it, and it's fields, and it doesn't have built form on. And it has the characteristics of open countryside. But the question is, should it be open countryside, or should it have a policy designation as greenbelt? And in order to elevate it above just open countryside to greenbelt, it has to be necessary to prevent merging, which it isn't. It has to be necessary to protect the historic town, which has to be York, not Copmanthorpe itself. It has to protect the unrestricted sprawl of the main urban area, not Copmanthorpe, the main urban area. And it has to protect encroachment into the countryside. And I think my point is, whether it's countryside or greenbelt, we shouldn't make a decision on whether it should be greenbelt or countryside because of how open it is. In terms of its current lack of buildings, we have to look at the purposes of greenbelt. And I just think that the correct designation is countryside, like you have in many other places, rather than every piece of land that isn't built on automatically being greenbelt. And I just don't see how this piece of land actually meets any of the purposes of greenbelt. It absolutely meets the purposes of countryside, and that's what it should be designated as.
Yeah, just to agree with Mr Napkis on that point, but again, there's a slight concern is that the council's approach is, with respect to the main urban area, to protect the compactness, we've drawn the boundaries tight, and then the villages beyond that, we've also then drawn the boundaries tight in order to protect the compactness of the villages, in effect, so that leaves us very little locations to go. And I just think that what we should have done is looked at the opportunities for sustainable development. And that brings us back to the reference to the plan, where you can see the ability to walk from this piece of land to the centre of a sustainable location within 800 metres. And I just think those opportunities, again, are missed opportunities that we may just regret later down the line. So I think our case still stands on that requested alteration to the Greenbelt boundary. Well,
I'll certainly, or my colleague and I will certainly have have a visit to this site as well, and pretty much all of those that are raised, so in due course. But Mr. Linus.
Thank you, sir. Just to come back to Mr. Narcos, I wasn't simply suggesting because land is countryside you designate it. I've specifically framed the reference that I gave in the context of the criteria that are applied as part of the methodology. And as Ms. Healy-Brown helpfully added, she explained how those references fed into a judgment under each of the purposes, including the relationship between York as a city and its outlying villages and the importance of the land surrounding those and confirming that relationship. As for Mr. Johnson's point, obviously the Council has, when designating the boundaries that it's proposing, taken into account the need to provide for sustainable development. It's allocated land in the settlement accordingly.
Thank you. We'll move along. Yes, carry on. I'm sorry, I can't read your nameplate.
Matthew Good, sir. There's going to be a fair bit of commonality in terms of some of the wider points that are made here, sir, so I do apologise for that, but I'm applying it to a different location, so I feel that I must do the same thing. So I invite you to look at page 245, which shows the boundaries around Strensall. I'll wait till you get there, sir, because I think it's on page 252 on the PDF version. Specifically referring to boundary 4, but I will make reference to boundary 1 as well, just out of a comparator. Boundary 4, like we've heard on a previous occasion, was a mission site in its entirety, or parts thereof, because the client which I represent was happy for elements of that boundary for a mission to come forward in its various formats, be that to the north of the railway line or to the south of the railway line. It's also fair to say this site was, in previous iterations of this plan, in its many years of production, identified to be removed from the Greenbelt as well, sir. So previous studies have considered that this site in its entirety shouldn't be within the Greenbelt, and it's something which I'd invite you to have a look at the site, as you've already said you will do, sir. One of our first issues with Boundary 4, sir, irrespective of the site selection methodology, which I know you'll look at in due course and will make decisions upon, is that the boundary is, as is the case in many of the areas, quite large. It surrounds built development on 3 sides, with the 4th side open towards Strensall Common. However, the northern element of Boundary 4 is actually dissected by the railway line, which is obviously quite a clear defensible boundary, and something which I'll come back to, sir. One of our key concerns with the scale of the boundary in this instance and the different land uses which it goes over, i.e. there being the railway line at one element of it and the common at the other element of it, is that we consider, if you'd have drawn those boundaries slightly smaller, you may well have come to slightly different conclusions into how much of an impact this had in terms of the Greenbelt purposes. In terms of the boundary as it does currently stand, the topic paper refers, as we've heard, to the historic character of the settlement as opposed to York. It mentions the conservation area. It also mentions a small area of ecological environmental designation. Fair enough, sir, but those, as has previously been mentioned, are actually not specific issues for the Greenbelt, York being the key settlement. And whilst I understand the Council's reference to the clock face, it goes back to the point which Mr. Johnson made around where we're really limiting if we apply that to every settlement within York, and I'm not aware of any other plan that's ever sought to do that to every settlement within its area. There is also some confusion, and in fact, I'll ask you to go to page 262, sir, just as a quick reference, if that's okay. get there myself as well. Which shows the consistency with the local plan strategy. Interestingly, sir, other than a small area of nature conservation designation to the north of the railway line, none of this site, which is identified to be wholly within the Greenbelt, fulfills any of the criteria set out by the council. And it's because of these reasons we struggle with its entirety being placed within the Greenbelt boundary. Furthermore, and it's a point which Mr Johnson made with regards to Copmanthorpe, but it also applies to this site, sir, it's also within the 800 metres if you flip over the next page of services within the village itself. Within our statement, sir, we do provide a analysis which I won't go through in detail because you've got that in writing in front of you, but I will draw your attention to page 254 of the council's document. When I get there, I'll go through it. Which, in relation to boundary 4, which is towards the bottom end of that page here, it talks about sprawl, but it talks about it in quite a confused manner. It suggests that this element, because of development on all three sides, could limit sprawl, which could take place within Strensel, which is the second sentence there. But yet, it then concludes that development within the boundary itself could create sprawl, which I find difficult to see how those two things necessarily work together. It either creates sprawl in terms of the wider Greenbelt setting, or it doesn't. Any development on open land would create some form of sprawl, sir, and it seems that the council has simply gone, there is no development there at the moment, therefore it must be within the Greenbelt, and we'll argue sprawl even though we say it could limit sprawl, which I find quite a confused sentence. And finally, sir, in terms of defensible boundaries, and I'll just invite you to go back to, apologies for this, back to page 245. Just because it's easy, I always find it easier to see it rather than go through the text. For the northern sections in particular of boundary 4, sorry sir, I haven't got it myself, where we're using, or rather the council are using the rear gardens as the defensible boundary, as opposed to a much clearer boundary, in our opinion, of the railway line, that just sits just to the south of it. Interestingly, I won't invite you to go back again so you can do it at your leisure, boundary 1 doesn't use the same criteria. Boundary 1 uses the River Foss. Elements of the River Foss actually fit within some of those site selection criteria, and the boundary does too. I can't understand the logic of using one clear, to be fair, boundary in terms of the River Foss rather than rear gardens in boundary 1, but yet in boundary 4 we ignore the railway line and instead go for the rear gardens at that stage, particularly when the boundary 4 element doesn't have any of the criteria set out within page 262 of the document. I'll leave it there, sir.
Mr. Linus.
Brown to summarise the council's position on this, please.
Thank you. So, Mr. Good's taken us through a number of parts of the assessment, so you can see that in annex from A4245 onwards. So we're talking particularly about the area to the south of boundary 4, I understand, up to the railway line. On page 248, it explains why the alternative of using the railway line for boundary 4 has been considered but not included in this instance. primarily due to the impact on the historic character of the village. And we come back to the same point again as we were doing previously about the understanding of how Purpose 4 has been developed and applied in relation to York, and recognising that this is different perhaps to experiences people might have in other locations, but it relates to the heritage features of York as a city and its surroundings as well. And you can see in the assessment that it looks at the criterion, as I mentioned on the previous location we were looking at, and in this instance we have the compactness of the village, but we also have the conservation area as a key part of this village as well. Mr. Good mentioned some confusion around sprawl and what was meant in this instance. I think my explanation around that is we acknowledge that it is a relatively large location, and that's where sprawl can then take place potentially within it, and that just clarifies what he found confusing. I hope helps clarify that section. And then finally, in relation to boundary 4 compared with boundary 1. So boundary 4, as described, follows the rear of the curtilage of the properties. As you know, sir, from other locations that we've discussed over the last few weeks, this is a consistent approach, and the council would advocate that this is a recognisable and permanent boundary. We do recognise that this is different to the approach that was taken around boundary 1, however, and that might be a matter for your consideration of boundary 1 rather than necessarily for your consideration of boundary 4. And as Mr. Good rightly says, boundary 1 has followed the River Foss rather than the rear curtilage of those properties. Now, clearly the river is a recognisable and permanent boundary, but you could also say the rear of those properties could also provide that, and that would be another alternative which we would invite you to consider on your site visit. But as I say, that relates to boundary 1 rather than necessarily boundary 4.
Thank you. Mr. Good?
Thank you, sir. There's obviously a clear difference of opinion, which I suspect we won't resolve here, sir, and hence I would invite you to go and see the relevant boundaries. I suppose in response to what's just been said, I still have some confusion, however. With regards to the sprawl angle, I did set off my commentary around, well, admittedly, boundary 4 is a large area. The question and the reason I raised the issue of the railway line at the outset and the size of that boundary was, would you really get sprawl if you were developing to the north of the railway? Given that's a significant less significant incursion than it would be to the south of the railway. Now, clearly, my client would wish you to consider it as a whole, but we're understanding the process that the council's gone through. I would also invite you again, sir, just in terms of those village setting issues which were raised, etc., just invite you again to look at page 262 and the council's assessment of village setting in respect to this site. Now, admittedly, this is just a diagram, and I fully accept other site-specific issues may come into play. However, this doesn't indicate village setting in any respect, sir. And it's those discrepancies and contradictions within the council's own evidence which leads us to a conclusion as to, it almost seems that what they've done is they've identified the extant existing boundary of the settlement and just gone with that without any real detailed consideration of where the Greenbelt boundary should actually lie.
Thank you. Yes, I understand the point. But certainly, Strensel is on our list of visits. I think we have a trip to the barracks to arrange at some stage as well, don't we? But Mr. Lyons.
Yes, sir, obviously we accept you would need to go on site on this. I think the only point it emphasises that you must read the assessment of Strensel as a whole. Insofar as reference is made to this diagram, you must also recognise that we have looked at the setting of the village in the in the text and reached judgments on that, going beyond what has been identified in the plan. As for sprawl, I think the short point that is being made at 254 is that the assessment fairly recognises that the site that's being promoted here is surrounded by existing development on 3 sides, but the fact that it is a large site north of the railway line does mean that sprawl is going to occur within the site and also when seen in the context of the village, and that's relevant under Purpose 1. And we say that given the size of the site, this has to be taken into account alongside other factors, including the railway line and the boundary that we've proposed in reaching the judgment. The mere fact that the railway line lies further to the south is not on its own a reason to extend the green belt boundary there when sprawl would take place. Neither is alleged inconsistency with another boundary, which Ms Healy-Brown has dealt with. The boundary, we say, for this side of Strensel is justified and broadly following the line of the built development when taking into account the potential for sprawl as well. So again, sir, it's really a matter for you to visit in the context of wider considerations relating to Strensel.
Mr. Caithness.
Thank you, sir. So I'm here regarding 2 sites, but the first site I'd like to discuss is Fulford, and it's pages 127 to 141 of the Annex 4 document. And it relates to boundary 4, the lighter blue line. And you'll see from the plan, sir, that it's a very small site, a slither of land at best. And it's bounded to the north by housing and to the east by housing, and to the south and west by 2 very significant urbanising influences, the A64 and the A19. So obviously we're here to talk about soundness of greenbelt decisions, about whether to put land in or out, whatever that may be. But we say that the Council's conclusion in relation to boundary 4 is unsound, sir, because when you actually go through the written document, and that's all we've got to go on here, sir, there are a couple of very significant and compelling points. If you want to start, for example, with Purpose 4 and preserving the setting of historic towns, on page 128, the Council say that boundary 4 is important to prevent coalescence with the design outlet to the southwest. But later in its assessment, it says the A19, and for that matter the A64 as well, on page 132, are strong barriers to the extent of sprawl beyond the built-up area. Then in relation to Purpose 1, checking unrestricted sprawl, the Council say that the A19 is a strong barrier. And in relation to safeguarding the countryside from encroachment, Purpose 3, page 134, sir, the Council say overall boundary 4 lacks the feeling of openness. So anything that lacks the feeling of openness, given that Greenbelt is all about openness and preserving that, well, if it's not open already, there's no sound compelling reason to keep it open. The Council also say that beyond the site, beyond the A64 and the A19, there's large fields between the site and the designer outlet. So whichever greenbelt purpose so that you look at in relation to this particular boundary, there's significant holes in the assessment. So we can only go on the assessment, the written assessment in front of us. The Council set out its position, But which is it? They're saying it's open and then they're saying it's not open. They're saying it has a feeling of countryside as you approach from the south, and then they say that there's major urbanising influences. So there's significant contradictions in terms of the assessment, and because of that, that's why it's unsound for me as a planner. And we're not necessarily here on behalf of our client to promote the site for housing. We accept that that's not the purpose of today's exercise. But there's been some interesting and quite helpful points put forward about the future and preparing the plan positively. Mr. Pilcher said that, and we would agree with that, that when it comes down to it, some of these boundary decisions, in the end, appear, a lot's been written, but there's discrepancies, and because of that, we think boundary 4 doesn't need to be there. The more obvious and the clearer boundary would be along the A19 and A64, so it would allow potentially for a very, very small and inconsequential amount of development, possibly sometime in the future. But we're not even saying it has to be within the development limit. It could remain open countryside. So, but the decision and the exercise today is about green belt and openness. And this site isn't required for any of the purposes. So obviously we'd hope you go and have a look and reach a judgment on that. So.
Okay, we'll deal with this site first, shall we, Mr. Caithness, because I know you've got another one.
Thank you.
Mr. Linus.
Defined any statement where this was raised, but we'll see if we can deal with this as it stands. Again, sir, it's really an invitation to you to read the relevant pages in the annex from pages 1 to 8 through to 140, and I'd ask you to note under criterion 1 relating to compactness that there's a recognition that boundary 4 is considered to be important in preventing coalescence with further development to the southwest, including the designer outlet. There is also a reference on page 130 that we draw your attention to, where it says that land beyond boundaries 4 and 5 is designated as green wedge. On page 131, it said that for boundaries 3, 4 and 5, there's some potential for sprawl as features including the A64 and the A19 applied to other boundaries as well. These nearby features are not immediately adjacent to the boundary, and sprawl could occur into the open land. So we'd invite you to take those points into consideration under the different criteria. And you've heard me say it before, but it's really a question of judgment for you to go onto land, having read those points.
Yeah, I'll just come back quickly on that, sir. Obviously, might be and could be. They lack conviction, don't they? These things won't occur, sir, because if boundary 4 is moved in a sound fashion to be alongside the urbanising influences of the A19 and the A64, there simply can't be any kind of sprawl or coalescence or impact on historic setting. I mean, it just doesn't make sense, and there's no logic. And yeah, I would invite you to just see the discrepancies within the councils.
Sorry, so just to before we move on to the next site, and just so we can check for our records and to help you, was there? We can't see a hearing statement that was prepared dealing with this, but we'll check for that.
Yeah, there's no hearing statement. We're relying on our July 21.
July 21 reps. Okay, thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Pilcher, did you want to make a point about this?
Thank you, sir. Yeah, obviously it's not something I've ever made a representation on. I'm not, and have no interest in Fordlands Road, but I totally pick up on those points, and I just actually wanted to say, I mean, obviously I'm not a professional planner. I might be unusual here in that I'm just a builder, and probably far too simple. But
I'm not a professional planner either, so I wouldn't worry too much.
That's great, sir. My point is that, as far as I'm aware, this plan's being examined under the transitional arrangements, which means we have to spend our time looking over and over back at the 2012 document. It's not unusual to look at documents that are increasingly out of date when you work around York, but it says, number 80, to check the unrestricted sprawl of large built-up areas. Now, when the council talk, they've done it about the New Lane site, which is the Huntington one that we look forward to the appeal decision on. They'll often talk about sprawl within a site in itself. You know, sprawl, because you're going to start building plot 1, by the time you've built plot 246, everyone who was in plots 1 to 10 are complaining about sprawl within the site. And as a builder, I know that quite frequently people complain about the planning consent at the other end of the site, but it is what it is. But I keep coming back to this fact, it's unrestricted sprawl. The council often use the word sprawl, but I think when you look at some of these boundaries, like Mr. Goods, I'm aware of that land because we were once offered a small part of it years ago, and obviously it hasn't come to anything because it gets treated as though it may be in the general extent of a greenbelt. But the council are supposed to be looking for boundaries that can be readily recognisable and permanent, and things like that railway line, that looks pretty strong. You won't be walking across it, and in the same way, this boundary that's just been referred to at Fordlands, that also looks an extremely strong boundary, and to try and say it might merge Fulford with the designer outlet is positively ridiculous. So my point is, every time the council says sprawl to you, I would hope that in the back of your mind you're thinking unrestricted sprawl, and that we're looking for wonderful opportunities to find good permanent boundaries, such as railways. I mean, they've chosen to use the River Foss for boundary 1 because it's a good boundary, because it makes perfect sense to use the River Foss, because if it doesn't feel like the River Foss is going to move, and I don't think the railway is going to move. So my only point on that is about they should be consistently using the word unrestricted sprawl, not sprawl within sites, not saying you start at one end of a site and you've got sprawl by the end of it. And then something I had made in my representations, and it may well be in my July 21, something about turning on supply of housing. When we go back to our 2012, and I'm not sure if it's still in the 2019 or the 2021 or will be in any future ones, but paragraph 47, we're trying to significantly boost the supply of housing. And in my representations, I'll often make reference to this buffer, but also a variety of sites. So what's just been referred to in Fulford is just the type of small, medium site that would be quickly deliverable, and that small, medium house builders like ourselves would love to be able to do something with. So I know that what gets presented to you in this plan is a local authority who want to deal with everything in massive sites. And I've written to other people saying that 97% of all the plots in this are effectively strategic housing sites, that you just don't have any flexibility to turn on housing supply if you're dependent on 5 PLCs. Whereas if you had dozens of much smaller organisations and much smaller sites, you could genuinely deal with the persistent undersupply problem that's referred to in paragraph 47, second part of paragraph 47, where it refers to local authorities that have a record of persistent underdelivery. And I can't think of a local authority that's worse than the City of York. So thank you very much, sir. That's my final point.
Thank you, Mr. Pilcher. Mr. Lannis, you want to come back?
Just very briefly, apart from noting the roving builder's eye over a number of sites in York that he hasn't made representations on, I think largely what we've heard is relating to matters on housing need and methodology that we've covered, and I don't need to address those, apart from saying that there will be instances in the Annex 4 document where the word stray is used, and it's important to be clear that, at least in some instances, the word sprawl is used in the context of the particular methodology that's been applied by the Council when one's looking at the compactness criterion and the relationship between settlements in the City of York. And one needs to bear that in mind when one's reading the document. But beyond that, I don't think I need to add anything further, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Jennings.
Thank you, sir. As I said earlier, I'm here representing Mr. Miller in a site in Merton Industrial Estate, which is the drawings on page 164 of the document 59F, and in particular